4 trials have now been completed. Reflecting a mixture of the warrior trials and her own inner struggles, these crucibles concluded with the forging of a new blade. The sword is named for a legendary weapon from the Volsunga saga, Gramr. It was a sword attained by Sigmund and later used by his son Sigurd to slay the dragon Fafnir. In the tale, Odin plunged the sword into the heart of a great tree located in the center of King Volsungar's hall. Prince Sigmund pulled the sword free, and the story proceeded from there. This sounds familiar as Senua's mind constructed her current scenario from these old stories. In the center of a small area stands a tree with a newly reforged sword plunged into the trunk. With the 4 trials behind her, she is now able to pull Gramr free, but in doing so, her shadow voice rears its head and plunges her deep into the sea of corpses. But first, she experiences a vision, one that details events right after the plague swept through her home village. The surviving population blamed her for this calamity. Dillion's father lay deceased from this illness. In her head, she believes he blames her too. This belief is what twists her world into this corrupted river full of rotted remains. Senua was told over and over she was responsible, that the blood of her village was on her hands. Her fragile mind began to believe it as well. Now she stands in a red river surrounded by the corpses she believes are her doing. This world is a fabrication constructed by guilt. But not a legitimate guilt, a perceived one. Senua did not cause this plague. This blood is not on her hands. But the words of her father and the villagers convinced her otherwise. In the aforementioned scene, the lighting gives a visual cue of when Senua's perception changes, transitioning from her true memory to a false one. Blue lighting illuminates the scene as she looks down upon Dillion. She reaches out to console him in his moment of grief. However, as soon as she touches him, the shadow voice booms and the lighting turns red. It speaks of her responsibility for all of this death. Immediately, Dillion's voice turns from grief to an angry and accusing tone. This color swap is the visual transition between a true version of these events and the false reality she believes is true. Let's watch it and you'll see what I mean.
Dillion? Everyone suffered.
My father was not supposed to die like this.
Do you see it clearly now, Senua? The suffering you've caused.
This is your fault. You brought this plague to us! You have blood on your hands!
Dillion's voice and the shadows merge together, forming this false, all-encompassing emotion as her awareness transitions into the sea of corpses. Before exploring the level itself, let's discuss guilt for a moment. At its root, it is defined as a feeling of responsibility or remorse for some offense, crime, or wrong, whether real or imagined. Largely, it can be divided into 2 types, true guilt and false guilt. These can be further classified as healthy and toxic accordingly. One helps us climb to mental freedom, while another casts us down into a spiral of mental imprisonment. Healthy guilt is a positive thing. It informs us that something we have done is wrong. The fact we feel guilty means we recognize this fact. Taking this feeling, one can move to better themselves, to begin a path of healing. Whether that means confession, seeking forgiveness, or repentance in one form or another. It leaves a scar on our psyche that reminds us of where we overstepped. But at the same time, it can be a life lesson to never do it again. False guilt, on the other hand, can be broken up into 2 types, those that originate from within and those from without. When coming from within, this sense is rooted in unrealistic expectations. If one falls short of their own standards, whether this be actions or morality, their own conscience may kick in. Their internal Jiminy Cricket begins to condemn them. Even if the thing itself is innocent and not considered a sin, we convince ourselves it is and can descend into self-flagellation and shame. When false guilt originates from without, it takes the shape of an external accuser. This is the form it takes for Senua. The voice of the people and her father become an external accusation, convincing her one voice at a time until she has come to believe it herself. Her mind accepts a false reality as true and leads her down a dark path, one that nearly led her to taking her own life. There is a reason one title for the devil is the accuser. These false accusations almost led her to a sin which would condemn her soul. Even within the backdrop of Norse mythology, this act would have sent her soul across the Bridge of the Damned, never to return. Her soul would be barred from Valhalla forever. With this in mind, let's listen to her shadow's voice, which reinforces this concept.
Do you hear the suffering, Senua? Does your precious gift of sight let you see the souls that rot here in this sea of corpses? Do you feel the blood running cold on your skin? Do you hear their endless cries? Do you smell their putrid wounds? They were once brothers, sisters, and loved ones. And look at what you have done to them. All because you were a coward, because you banned from your curse instead of facing it. When you turned your back on your father, Zimbo, you turned your back on the gods and let the darkness wreak havoc on your people. Why must they pay for your heresy?
During this section, Senua is forced to travel through a red river, fighting through the shades of the Northmen and taunted with these dark thoughts. Gameplay-wise, we reintroduce a mechanic that ties into her mental experience. In the past, when she is confronted by an enemy that cannot be harmed by her sword, Senua would use an iron mirror to make them physical. Now this new Sword Gramr can make them physical with a simple parry or charged attack. But why are some of the Northmen material and some made of dark vapor? The following will be my interpretation, let me know what you think. Enemies that are met in the world are things we can confront, things we can fight, things that if we swing a sword, it hits them. Inside the mind, these enemies are not a physical threat. Thoughts and emotions are as elusive and vaporous as this enemy type. Even when aware of their existence, our attempts to destroy them just go straight through. In a previous episode entitled Bridge to Hell, I discussed the reason sword symbolism is relevant. In the minor arcana of tarot, the sword is the symbol of the mind and air. When sharpened and used properly, the sword can make us masters of navigating the mind. Just like the enemies we see in the Sea of Corpses, thoughts and emotions are like air, something we cannot see, but we can always feel its presence and influence. Senua's journey to reforge the Sword Gramr through the last 4 trials was her way of tempering her mind's ability to navigate her psyche. While her old sword couldn't do it, this new one can force the airy enemies to become solid, to take a form she can fight and move onward. Without this new sword, she would be unable to traverse this river and succumb to the false reality her mind creates. This begs the question though, what is the river she finds herself traveling through? On all sides are rotting corpses reaching out to her, whispering and writhing in pain. In her head, each of them is one of her victims, a reflection of her false sense of guilt. To further elaborate on this, we'll take a look at the important rivers in mythology. In Norse mythology, the river leading to the gates of the underworld was called Gjöll. This is the one she uses at the start of the game. However, if we leave Norse mythology behind for a moment, another famous river fits the one we see in the Sea of Corpses. That is the river Acheron, found in Hades, the Greek underworld. Acheron is one of the 5 rivers in Hades. It is known as the River of Woe or the River of Pain. At the end lies the Acherusian Lake. All of the woe we accumulate in our lives is carried with us down the length of the Acheron until it spills into the lake. From here, the soul is confronted with the totality of their sins. If they are strong enough to deal with facing the unfiltered darkness of their soul, they are cleansed and allowed to move on to one of the afterlives. If not, they are tossed into Tartaros to suffer a hellscape of their own making. This location can be found in various faith systems. The Acherusian Lake is mentioned by name in a non-canon book called The Life of Adam and Eve, or in the Greek version, The Apocalypse of Moses. On page 37 of this book, it details how after Adam's death, he is plucked up by a seraphim who takes him to the Acherusian Lake to be purified. In the Syrian version, it is called the Sea of the Eucharist. In the non-canon Book of Enoch, it is called Nahar Dinur, in which souls must bathe before receiving their final baptism and entering paradise. While none of these are the basis for Hellblade's writing, and certainly not intended to be a comparison by the writers, the general idea seems fitting enough. Senua's false sense of guilt is carried along the river, forcing her to confront what she falsely believes are sins of her past. It is overwhelming and too much to bear. Her shadow attempts to convince her that it would be easier to simply give in, to run away from her horror and join her mother in the afterlife, because she does not feel strong enough to confront her perceived sins. And if she fails in this Acherusian Lake experience, she will literally be cast off a cliff and, allegorically, be consumed into Tartaros. In her head, she sees herself climbing up the side of a mountain towards the face of her mother, and walks to the edge, preparing to jump and escape it all.
That night, she gave up on her world to follow in the footsteps of her mother, to go to a place where the darkness couldn't reach her.
Senua. Look at me.
Do you hear them? They're calling for me.
We've lost so many. And I've lost my father. I can't lose you.
You said it. I have blood on my hands.
I didn't say that. You've done nothing wrong.
Symbol was right. Everyone will suffer.
Symbol is a fake. He is a hateful, bitter liar. He's poison. And his words still haunt you. Who do you trust? Him? Or me?
After the plague, Dillion literally and psychologically pulls her back from the edge, guiding her back into the light. The powerful voice of her father acted as the archetypal accuser, planting the seed of her painful guilt. The surviving villagers watered the seed until it bloomed into a horrifying garden of rotted corpses. Despite the power these voices had on her, Dillion's voice was greater. Sometimes all we need is one trusted voice to forgive us or help us see that our dark thoughts are illusory. The Sea of Corpses became a microcosm of her Acherusian Lake experience, one that, with a little help, she endured and moved past.
The hardest battles are fought in the mind. He gave her the sword with which to fight in more ways than one. And she gave him her word, never to surrender. All she needed was a little help, a little hope.
Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed, please drop a like and subscribe to receive updates on future uploads. If you would like to help support the channel, a Patreon has been set up and the link is in the description below. Have a great day and peace be with you all.